Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you, Mariella. Thank you, Ariel. And thank you all for coming. I'm going to give you a talk that's called Nature Wants Us to Be Fat. I do have a book that just was published on this topic. And I have a lot of NIH grants and so forth. I've been studying this for a long time. So the issue is that we're trying to figure out the cause of obesity and diabetes. And a lot of people have done this by trying to figure out what went wrong to why they became obese and what could be driving it. And I was thinking that, one potential new approach to trying to answer this might be to kind of think outside the box and to think about the fact that obesity can be a beneficial response in animals to help them survive. And so if we could understand how animals regulate their weight and how they gain weight, maybe we can get an insight into our epidemic. So most mammals tightly regulate their weight. So if you take an animal in the wild, for example, a hibernating squirrel, and you take that animal and you force feed it so that you can force it to gain weight, then as soon as you quit force feeding it, it will go back to the weight it's supposed to be. And for that time of the year. Likewise, if you fast an animal and make it lose weight, and then stop the fasting, it will go back to its normal weight. Normally, most animals regulate their weight well, and you know that for us, many of us have no problem with weight. We can eat what we want in the beginnings of our life. And you feel you're invincible. You can drink anything. I've heard people say, I can eat anything I want, I'm not going to gain weight. And they're usually 20 years old and athletic. But there are some animals that purposely try to gain weight at certain times of the year. Nesting animals, for example, will like the emperor penguin, will increase its weight, almost double its weight in fat before it nests. Hibernating animals do the same thing in the fall. They'll dramatically increase their weight. And also birds that migrate long distance, like the bar-tailed godwit. It will migrate it can fly 11,000 kilometers 8 days straight without food or water. And it does it because it increases its fat right before it flies. Hold on. Yeah. Now, the next thing to realize is that when these animals start gaining weight, it isn't just fat. They actually develop an orchestrated response. They have uncontrolled appetite and thirst. They start foraging for food. They decrease their resting metabolism. And so when they're not foraging, they decrease their metabolism to conserve energy. They increase their fat stores, not just in their adipose, but also in their blood and in their liver. And they develop insulin resistance. And in this case, insulin resistance is being done as a mechanism to preserve glucose for the brain. Because if the animal feels that there's not enough food around, it wants to make sure it has enough glucose for the brain. And the brain, although it uses insulin, it uses less insulin and some of the brain uses very little insulin, whereas it's used heavily like in the muscle. So when you become insulin resistant, the blood glucose cannot enter the muscle very well, so it goes up in the blood, and that provides the fuel for the brain. So insulin resistance turns out to be a survival response in the wild. Now, another really key finding is that fat is not just a source of calories. So when a bear hibernates, it uses the fat as an energy source, so then when there's no food around, it can break down the fat to produce the calories, the ATP, the energy it needs. But it also can be used to produce water. When fat is broken down, it generates water. So there's no water in fat, but when you metabolize fat, you produce water. You also, when you metabolize glycogen, another thing that goes up in these animals is they store glycogen, or the equivalent of starch. When you break down starch, you also produce water. And many animals use fat as their mechanism for providing them water when they need it. So when the bear hibernates, it uses the water it makes during the breaking down of the fat to help it while it's hibernating. The fat-tailed lemur also hibernates in the summer, in the dry season, because it uses its fat to provide the water that it can't find. And likewise, in the desert, animals like the camel uses fat to help provide water when there's not water around. And likewise, whales, they don't drink fresh water. They don't drink seawater. They drink fresh water. And so when they're in the ocean, of course, they get their water mainly from the food they eat, but about 1/3 of the water they get comes from fat. So the fat is a major source of water for animals in the wild. So what triggers an animal to gain weight? And one of the things that it turns out that seems to be very, very important is fructose. And fructose is the sugar that's present in fruit. And it's the main nutrient in fruit, which we think of as healthy. But unlike humans who are eating just a few fruit at a time, when an animal like a bear wants to store fat, it will eat huge numbers of berries, as many as 10,000 in a 24-hour period. And that fructose is used to trigger this biologic switch in which the animal suddenly becomes hungry, insulin resistant, and so forth. In our culture, we get most of our fructose from table sugar and from a sweetener called high fructose corn syrup. And table sugar, or sucrose, consists of a glucose and a fructose molecule together. So if you take fructose, like we did, and you put it in the drinking water for a laboratory mouse, the mouse will love the fructose and it will start drinking a huge amount. Now, initially, it controls its appetite. So for the first month, when it's on the fructose, it will take the calories it gets from the fructose and it will eat much less chow. So it will eat less chow in return for drinking the fructose so that its total calorie intake is about the same. So initially it tries to control its weight. But after about 1 month, the animal, or two weeks maybe, two to 3 weeks, the animal will become resistant to leptin. And leptin is a hormone that is released from the fat that tells you when you're full. So a lot of people who are leptin sensitive will tend to keep their weight at a normal weight because they get a signal to tell them when to stop eating. But if you're leptin resistant, which is true for most people with obesity, you tend not to get that signal to tell you to quit eating. And so what happens with fructose is after several weeks, they become leptin resistant, they start eating a huge amount of food, and their weight goes up, they drop their resting energy metabolism, they start foraging, they develop fatty liver, they develop insulin resistance, they develop increased body fat, their blood pressure goes up, they get the metabolic syndrome. So fructose absolutely causes that entire orchestrated response that animals use to help them survive during periods of food shortage. Now, interestingly, if you take that mouse and you knock out its sweet taste, and we've done this, so you can take away its ability to taste the sugar, And when that happens, normally a mouse, if you give it 2 bottles, with 1 bottle being water and 1 bottle being sugar or fructose, normally animals will drink about 80% of the time from the sugar bottle and 20% of the time from the water bottle. If you just give them 2 bottles of water, they will drink from each bottle about 50%. But if you take an animal and you remove its taste, you genetically knock out its taste, so it cannot taste sugar. In fact, we've done it where you have a mouse that can't taste anything, it will still prefer the sugar water. And it will get fat from the sugar water. So it's not the taste that makes the animal develop the metabolic syndrome. It's something specific to the fructose, and the animal senses it. They get a dopamine response even when they can't taste it, and they seek it out. Now, if you do that with the artificial sugar, they lose their desire for artificial sugar as soon as you knock out the taste receptor. But not true for these animals that like fructose. Not true for fructose. Now, another question is, do they get fat is it just because they eat too much? Because what happens is when you give them fructose, the animals start to eat more. They lose their control of appetite, but they also drop their resting energy metabolism. So theoretically, you might think that they would still gain weight if you fed all the animals the same amount. We call this pair feeding. And what you do is you take the animals and you give one group fructose and you give the other, a controlled diet. It's a carb diet, but non-fructose. And the idea is that if fructose makes you eat more, but you make all the animals eat the same, then even though they're hungrier, they may not gain weight. Well, when we do those experiments, they still gain weight because they're dropping their resting energy metabolism. So they're spending less energy. So they eat the same amount. If we force them to only eat the same amount, they do gain a little weight, but it's only a little. It's not the big weight gain. It's just a very subtle effect. It's something that you will not be able to show in a human in 3 months or 6 months. It would probably take a year or 2 years. It's not the main mechanism for weight gain. The main mechanism for weight gain is that fructose makes you eat more. But you do gain a little weight when you control it. But even if they eat the same, there's dramatic changes that occur in the fructose-fed rat. So if you give fructose to, we did this study. This is a study in which we put the animals on a diet. So they're eating 90 or 80% of what they normally eat. So they still maintained, in fact, increased their weight a little bit on the fructose, even though they were on a diet. But they're on a high sugar diet. And if they're on a high sugar diet, they get fatty liver, they get hypertension, they get fat in their, fatty deposits. They just don't gain weight. So if you put them on a diet, but you're eating a high sugar diet, you're going to create insulin resistance. And in fact, every animal became diabetic on a high sugar diet where they were calorically restricted. So fructose is very powerful. In fact, I have a series of patients who have diabetes with low BMI or fatty liver with low BMI, and you can do it. I even had a patient who was on a high sugar, low calorie diet who I hospitalized because they developed fatty liver and hypertension from their sugar diet. So what is it about fructose that does this? Well, fructose is the only nutrient, it's the only nutrient that lowers the energy in a cell instead of increases it. Normally when you eat calories, they're there to make energy. You eat food to make energy. The energy we make is called ATP. And that energy allows me to talk to you, for you guys to walk. It gives you the energy to run and to do everything. Thinking requires ATP. But the way to think of it is there's 2 types of energy. There's the energy that we use from moment to moment, which is called ATP. It comes from the mitochondria. And there's also stored energy. And stored energy is called fat or glycogen. So the balance is true. When you eat energy and you eat fructose, you're eating a certain amount of calories, which will be converted to energy. But the trick is that fructose produces less ATP and actually lowers the ATP in the cell, whereas it increases the stored energy. So the total energy is the same. The law of thermodynamics is held, but it's shifting the energy to stored energy. And the way it does it is through a very specific pathway. The ATP gets consumed. You have to, when you metabolize any food, you actually burn some ATP. And with fructose, the enzyme that drives it's uncontrolled. And so ATP levels fall in the cell only when you eat fructose. If you eat glucose, it doesn't happen. And when that happens, the ATP falls, the AMP is removed by a specific enzyme called AMP deaminase so that you can't recover the ATP. And then that's produced a substance called uric acid inside the cell, which goes to the mitochondria, causes oxidative stress, suppresses more ATP production from the mitochondria. This is how it blocks the mitochondria. It reduces the energy that the mitochondria make. It blocks a recovery enzyme called AMP kinase that keeps the ATP levels low in the cell, and that's an alarm signal. You get this big alarm, intracellular alarm, we don't have enough energy, and it triggers all these responses from insulin resistance, fat production, a reduction in fat, oxidation. The whole 9 yards are activated by that. And it turns out that drives in the brain, it stimulates areas in the brain that cause foraging. You can show it in humans with MRI. It stimulates fat synthesis, blocks fat oxidation, stimulates glycogen accumulation, induces insulin resistance, causes systemic inflammation, which is probably a host to help protect the animal from infection, raises the blood pressure, which is meant to help maintain the blood pressure in a dehydrated or a state where there's not enough nutrients. And it even reduces the oxygen needs for the animal, because when we breathe oxygen, we're using it primarily to make our ATP. The mitochondria require oxygen. And so when you reduce the mitochondria from producing energy, we end up in a low energy state, but we actually are using less oxygen. And there's some animals that make that use fructose to help them survive in states of low oxygen. It's sort of interesting. So this is a very fundamental pathway that is seen in a lot of animals. And we can document it, and we can show that it's going on with us. Now, the uric acid that is produced is sort of interesting because all humans have a higher uric acid than most other mammals. And that was due to a mutation that occurred in an enzyme called uricase. And that mutation occurred millions of years ago. And it raises the question of why did we get a mutation so that we get a higher uric acid response, for example, when we eat sugar or when we eat meats and so forth. Why would that happen? And so I was very interested in this, so I met up and worked with some anthropologists, Peter Andrews from the Museum of Natural History in London. And he's the world expert on this period of time when this mutation occurred. So it turns out that the mutation occurred about 15 million years ago, and our ancestors were apes at that time. They were apes that lived on fruit. They were mainly fruit eating. They lived in East Africa. And then around 17 million years ago, there was global cooling, not global warming. And Africa, which had been isolated from Europe, as global cooling occurred, the sea levels fell, polar ice caps formed, and a land bridge occurred. And these early apes, many of them migrated into Europe. Now, interestingly, global cooling continued, and by 12 million years ago or so, these animals, which initially were living on fruit all year round, especially in Europe where it got cooler, they started starving, and there was seasonal starvation. And my friend Peter had actually been studying this and had written papers in Nature and so forth, pointing out how that there was starvation and that these apes, especially in Europe, reduced in numbers and then became extinct. But what he showed, as well as others, was that the ancestor to humans actually came from a European ape that migrated back to Africa. And that European ape, when it came back, it had learned how, when the fruit was running out, it learned how to come out of the trees to forage for food, to find alternative foods like tubers and plants. And it was this ape that had learned that came back to Africa to become the ancestors of all great apes as well as humans. And so the question we had was, could this mutation have occurred to, when fruit was becoming less available, to increase the ability to store fat so that they could survive those seasonal winters? And through a series of studies, I'm not going to go through it, but we actually documented that if you take an animal and you inhibit its uricase, so that, like what happened to us, then they become very sensitive to sugar. So if I give sugar to a rat, I have to give it huge amounts to make it develop metabolic syndrome. But if I inhibit uricase, I only have to give it a little sugar. And we don't have uricase. And we also resurrected the extinct gene as well, so we did studies like that. But bottom line is, everyone in this room is sensitive to sugar. You are all sensitive to the effects of fructose, much more than any other animal. And it's because of a mutation millions of years ago. So we became sensitive to sugar, and then sugar intake went up, and then high fructose corn syrup increased, and so you can see that sugar intake actually has increased dramatically. It has fallen. Chris is right. It's fallen since 2006, but the reality is that we're eating huge amounts of it. And just to give you an idea, fructose in natural fruit is relatively, there's only small amounts. When you eat a natural fruit, it's got vitamin C and other things that actually that counter the effects of fructose, because fructose causes fat through an oxidative stress pathway in the mitochondria, and so the vitamin C actually helps counter it. But as fruit ripens, the vitamin C content falls, the fructose becomes more potent, and that's what animals look for, the fruit that's ripe, where the vitamin C content's low. And the correlation between sugar intake and diabetes is extremely strong. And you can induce diabetes and obesity with giving sugar to animals. And there's millions of studies showing the correlation in humans, both within cultures, with the introduction of sugar into different societies. It's quite dramatic. And uric acid levels have also increased over this last century. So people with high uric acid and gout are have some of the highest associations with obesity, diabetes, and kidney disease, fatty liver, etc. And so if you look here, this is the NHANES data. As you look at uric acid levels, you can see how the prevalence of obesity and diabetes is linear. And this is over here where it says no uricase native diet. We did studies in the Umami Indians. We did studies in zoos looking at primates that have lost the uricase mutation. The mutation itself only took the uric acid up to 3. In 1920, that was the normal uric acid. But you can see that there's a very strong relationship between obesity, diabetes, hypertension, CKD. So this led me to think that the problem of obesity was sugar. And I actually wrote my first book. It was a low fructose diet book, the first book on low fructose diet back in 2008. And while it worked for a lot of people, it didn't work for everyone. And a lot of people told me, you know, it's not just fructose, it's carbs. And then we had this big discovery. Okay, the big discovery is that fructose can be produced in the body from that you can make fructose, and you make it from glucose. And there's only one way, and this is the way it works. So you can make fructose in your body. And what we found is that when you go on a high-carb diet, especially high glycemic carbs, that you produce this glucose, and it gets converted to fructose. We also found that the enzyme that converts it is turned on in crisis, like with dehydration, or with low blood pressure, or low oxygen, or low blood flow. All those activate the enzyme. And one of the big ways is with salt. So when you eat salt, you create a dehydrated state, and that drives this reaction. Because the animal responds to dehydration by saying, I need to store fat as a source of water. Or I need to activate this pathway to increase my blood pressure when my blood pressure is low. Or, and you can even show this pathway gets activated in the heart. When you have a heart attack, this pathway is turned on in your heart. If you block that pathway, you can prevent cardiac remodeling, published in Nature. This, the evidence is very strong. Now, when we did this, so we thought to ourselves, couldn't we prove this? So we gave glucose to animals that could not metabolize fructose. So these animals are being fed high glycemic carbs, but they're not getting any fructose. But when we give it to them, they start producing fructose in their body. And then if we block the fructose metabolism, we can block the insulin resistance completely. We can block the fatty liver completely. It's not the insulin stimulation that causes insulin resistance. Insulin's bad. I completely agree with Ben. When the insulin levels are high, it blocks fat lipolysis. But what's driving the high insulin is not the glycemic carbs, it's the fructose. If I block fructose metabolism, you can eat all the bread you want, you're not going to get diabetic. You still will gain some weight, though. You can see here that you still will gain some weight, a tiny bit of insulin resistance, but very little, really. We also found that mild dehydration can activate this pathway, and it's going to be an issue in climate change. We have some papers coming out on this. And animals try to do this purposely, like by eating salt, because that can stimulate this pathway so that they can convert the poor carbs they're eating into fat. And we can actually induce obesity in animals by giving a high salt diet. It isn't just sugar, but it takes a lot longer. So that's why French fries and salted is so much worse than regular potatoes, because the salt activates the enzyme to convert the carbs to fructose. It's really clever. If you take an animal and you give it a high salt diet and you block fructose metabolism, you actually block everything. They don't get fat, they don't develop insulin resistance, they don't get fatty liver, and you even block the hypertension response. The blood pressure is driven by this pathway. It's amazing. Cardiac hypertrophy is blocked. And it turns out that almost everyone who's overweight is dehydrated. Sugar itself is dehydrating. Salt is dehydrating. You can do various tests, and people who are overweight are dehydrated. They're on high salt diets. They're on high sugar diets. And when we take animals and we make them fat, and then we give them water to block that dehydration, we can actually suppress the development of obesity. We can reverse obesity. So drinking water is underrated as a mechanism. And we've actually identified a hormone that drives it. It's vasopressin levels, which are high in people with obesity, is actually responsible and is in this pathway. And it's working through cortisol because it's the V1B receptor, and glucagon. And you don't have to just get obesity from carbs. So when you activate the switch, it makes you hungry. So then when you give high-dense, high-fat foods, you dramatically increase weight. So fat is really important. But if you give fat alone, like we did studies where you give lard to an animal, they don't really gain weight. They stay leptin sensitive. The weight goes up a little bit, but they're leptin sensitive. You give them sugar, make them leptin resistant, now the weight gain goes up dramatically. You give carbs without fat, they gain weight only a little bit, but they're leptin resistant. But you allow them to eat that high fat, and they get the leptin resistance, then suddenly, and they have the carbs, they become very fat. And that's why a low-carb diet, you can eat high fat because you're not leptin resistant. That's why you can eat salt, because the way salt's working is through carbs. It's stimulating the glucose to convert to fructose. I'm almost done. So it turns out these foods can all do it. It turns out that umami foods, these include rich processed proteins, especially processed meats, but especially organ meats, and then things like beer, which have yeast. They will activate this pathway too. And we can make animals very obese by just giving them monosodium glutamate, or we can even make them fat by just putting uric acid in the drinking water. And it's activating this pathway, it's dropping the ATP. But interestingly, we haven't published it yet. The way it is working is it's working by activating the enzyme to convert glucose to fructose. So again, if you're on a carnivore diet, you're probably not going to get fat because the uric acid is priming you to make you fat as soon as you start eating carbs. So now you're carb sensitive, but you're not eating so many carbs, so you're safe for now. And then it turns out that this pathway is very important in dementia. It used to be thought that it's amyloid and it's tau protein, but the therapies aimed at that seem to be not working well. So people are looking upstream, and upstream, guess what it is? It's inflammation, mitochondrial dysfunction, and insulin resistance. And that's exactly what fructose does. All the risk factors for Alzheimer's are associated with either fructose production or fructose production or fructose intake. And if you give fructose to animals, or this is actually human studies, sugar intake is associated with a reduction in brain volume, hippocampal volume, a defect in memory. And if you give fructose to animals, you can show that they have trouble traversing a maze, they get decreased insulin signaling in the brain, they get the oxidative stress, the mitochondrial ATP. All these are the things you see in Alzheimer's disease. And then the proof really is that when you take patients with Alzheimer's disease, they have high levels of fructose in their brain. It turns out they're making the fructose in their brain. It isn't just coming from their food. I mean, it isn't coming from their diet. But they start making fructose in their brain 5 to 7-fold higher. And so I believe that this is the underlying pathway for Alzheimer's. So in summary, there's a survival switch. It controls obesity. It's driven by fructose, but it isn't just from the fructose we eat. It's also from high glycemic carbs, salty foods, and umami foods. The endogenous fructose requires you to be on carb diet to really have a big effect. Reducing sugar and high glycemic carbs, decreasing salt, increasing water intake can be beneficial. And then there's this real twist, just to point out that this is what initiates the process that causes these conditions, at least based on our work. But then once you've had hypertension for a long time, you start getting damage to the kidneys that causes the blood pressure to persist. Once you become obese for a long time, your mitochondrial numbers decrease, and so now it's that's driving the obesity. Once you start having insulin resistance over time, there's less and less production by the islets from hyalinosis of the islets, and so they become diabetic. It's sort of like developing a type 1. And then once the neurons start going and apoptosing it, you're not going to be able to recover by just reducing your diet of sugar. So that's it. Want to thank you, and happy to take questions.